EIS member of the Advisory Board, as an Honorary Senior Research Fellow at Sciences Po, and also now like the visiting professor at the Vietnam National University. We are, well, delighted to have you on board to hear your views on EU-ASEAN specifically today. So to start off the interview, well, the EU and ASEAN have actually recently upgraded their cooperation to a strategic partnership. How do you think that this will impact their cooperation? And how do you assess also like EU-ASEAN relations in general?
Okay, the term strategic partnership, for me, is a little bit problematical, okay? Because the expression strategy implies you've got a goal. That is an objective you're trying to achieve. I think that the term strategic partnership, when we look at the EU's other strategic partnerships, actually has more to do with saying this relationship is important. It's like an honorary degree, you know. It's like you've got a medal added to your partnership, and so. But it's very much in keeping with the way ASEAN functions. Basically, the strategic partnership is about a process. It's about a process of dialogue on a number of issues, those that exist already, like climate change, others that could be added later on. So it's really a process about, you know, it's a statement about a process of dialogue and strengthening this dialogue, rather than suggesting that together we are going to achieve these particular objectives. So it's very much in keeping with the idea of ASEAN being, as neo-realists say, more process than really progress. But that's the point. I mean, the important thing about ASEAN is the process of ASEAN itself. The process of being together is important, is an objective in itself.
ASEAN has grown a lot. It's one of the largest economies in the world. But I think we might agree that it hasn't been really able of exploiting its potential. Often, the ASEAN way and the discussions taken by consensus are on the way. So how do you think ASEAN can actually evolve and unlock its potential while keeping this principle on board?
Well, I think ASEAN, the coup in Myanmar is a real wake-up call for ASEAN. It could be a tipping point for ASEAN, because if you go back a couple of years with the Rohingya crisis, when 700,000 people were expelled from Rakhine State in Myanmar into Bangladesh, where the United Nations talked about genocidal action, then ASEAN's response was very weak, despite some civil society complaints, particularly in majority Muslim countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. The ASEAN response as a whole was extremely weak. And I noticed just today that President Jokowi of Indonesia has called for for a special meeting of ASEAN about Myanmar, and it's really going to be a moment of truth, because can you allow this principle of non-interference mean that you're basically betraying your principles? Because number 7 in the ASEAN principle is the defense of democracy and human rights as part of their objectives as well. So can you allow an elected government not to be able to come in to be overthrown in a coup, and still claim that you are, as an association, defending a certain number of values, including democracy. So it's a real moment of truth, I think, for sullies, to put it in those terms, the reputation of all Southeast Asian countries. It will have spillover effects. When you got your reputational issues at stake, then the situation in Myanmar is not just an internal problem; it also starts to become your problem as well. It's a moment which will call into question the ASEAN way. Now, so we have with ASEAN, the same dilemma that we have with the European Union. What Christopher Hill from Cambridge calls the expectations capability gap. Mm-hmm. We have expectations about what the EU can do, and the question is, does the EU actually have the capacity to do those things? Well, it's a similar kind of situation with ASEAN. We have some expectations of what ASEAN should do, but the question is, does ASEAN have the capacity to do that? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, talking about trade and Singapore in particular, I mean, trade relations have always been at the forefront of EU-ASEAN cooperation, but an FTA, a free trade agreement with the ASEAN region as such, seems to be off the table at the moment. Nevertheless, the EU has negotiated successfully free trade agreements with Singapore, with Vietnam. Some others are actually currently still under negotiation. But on the other hand, there's also with Cambodia, the withdrawal of the EBA, everything but arms. How do you see trade relations between the EU and ASEAN developing?
Okay, this is a case of the expectations capability gap. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because ASEAN as an institution cannot sign free trade agreements. The EU can, because it comes under trade negotiations, and free trade agreements are a supranational responsibility of the Commission. Mm-hmm. So on trade, the EU does speak with one voice and has the legal capacity to sign free trade agreements. ASEAN does not. Hence, while having a free trade agreement with ASEAN could be an aspirational goal, it can only be an aspirational goal simply because ASEAN as an association doesn't have that capacity to sign a free trade agreement. Hence the fallback to bilateral free trade agreements with Singapore initially and with Vietnam. Now, the Vietnam free trade agreement, the EU-Vietnam free trade agreement, is very important. It is a case where Europe's market power, to use the term of my colleague from the University of Edinburgh, David Camroux, actually plays out. It's all about market access, it's about money. So the Vietnamese agreed in that free trade agreement to a number of concessions, say on free trade unions, on environmental considerations that they would have been unwilling to do in normal circumstances. Well, simply because they want access to the European market. Okay. Now, so when it comes down to Europe's market power, then Europe can bring about change for the better. Now, that's when the problem begins, which is a question of how can you impose and how can you check? What are the compliance mechanisms? How can you actually force, another party to actually do that? And if they do, how can you, in fact, enforce compliance?
In one of your latest articles, ASEAN members can eat their cake and have it too. You published, I think, a few months ago. You quoted some benefits of ASEAN membership. And you talked about the EDGER benefit. And you said that often ASEAN is the default options for some countries, for example, on the US-China relations. So what do you mean by default option?
Okay, this comes to the question of ASEAN centrality, okay, mm-hmm. which is the non-interference ASEAN centrality. The first thing to say about ASEAN centrality, and it's shown in a brilliant essay by a scholar, British scholar actually in Canberra called Matthew Davies, who wrote this terrific little book called Ritual and Region, and in which he argues the point which I've said less eloquently, that ASEAN's a lot about ritual and process. You know, these meetings where everybody holds their arms together and expresses undying solidarity with each other. But he makes the point that the term ASEAN centrality only actually comes into official sort of discourse in 2006. Okay. Now, sure, before that, we talked about ASEAN in the driver's seat and that kind of thing. But this notion of ASEAN centrality, really emerged in 2006. It's now an issue because of the talk about the Indo-Pacific as after the Asia-Pacific. So let's look at East Asia in the larger sense. Japan can not be seen as leading because of the memory of the war and other factors. China's leadership is not something that is acceptable to the US or to other partners or to the ASEAN countries. So it's been, convenient for external powers from Southeast Asia, like the US, China, the EU, South Korea, even smaller countries like Australia, to see ASEAN as a kind of homogenous bloc, which is not, but to let ASEAN be the kind of pivot around which Asian regionalism can be constructed. Hence I remember being at the first meetings in 2005, the East Asia Summit. The East Asia Summit came into being because Mahathir at the time, Prime Minister Mahathir, Malaysian Prime Minister at the time, was talking about an East Asian grouping, which would basically be Asia without the Caucasians, which he saw as competing with APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. So the East Asia Summit, which is basically ASEAN plus 6 or ASEAN plus 3 plus 6, then became a convenient forum to achieve both what Mahathir wished to have, which was a larger grouping, but also to be inclusive to the other countries. So to have ASEAN as a center of that was a good default option for China and for the US. And in the problem at the moment is that the notion of the Indo-Pacific is perhaps threatening to ASEAN centrality. Which is why, and I've also written on that, is why the Indonesians pushed so strongly for this thing called the ASEAN Outlook of the Indo-Pacific, which was agreed to in June 2019. But it's a very weak kind of document. It basically says that this is the way we in ASEAN see the Indo-Pacific. Well, it doesn't actually say what we want to do in the Indo-Pacific or what our goals are, but, it simply restates the idea that in the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN should be central. Well, that is under challenge because for the first time began under the last stage of the Trump administration, when Donald Trump was president, may he rest in peace. And before we now return to having a reliable partner in the United States under the Biden administration, something called the Quad. These meetings began in 2007, but they were always held in association with ASEAN-related summits. The ASEAN, so you'd have an ASEAN meeting then with the dialogue partners and the East Asia Summit, and then on the sidelines you'd have the Quad leaders meeting. Okay, well, the last days of the Trump administration, the first meeting was held outside of ASEAN, quite separate. And just, a week ago, last Friday, I think, there was a second meeting held with President Biden, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Suga, and Prime Minister Scott Morrison, in which, we acknowledge ASEAN well, they didn't even actually talk about ASEAN centrality. they tip their hat to the notion of ASEAN centrality, but the reality is that these meetings are being held outside of an ASEAN context, and that is the first time. That was not the case with APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, 4 adjectives in search of a noun, as we say. The APEC meetings were usually held more or less at the same time as ASEAN summits. The principle going back to 1989 was created, where every second APEC meeting was held in an ASEAN country. So, but this is a different game this time with the Indo-Pacific. It's because it's, I'm sorry to cop out. This is a cop out. It's too early to say, but I think it's something to be observed.
And I mean, the EU is also now currently drafting its own policy and strategy for the Indo-Pacific. To what extent do you think that the EU and the ASEAN strategies or outlook have synergies, or where are there points of cooperation and divergence?
European strategy outlook on the Indo-Pacific, of course, comes from 3 strategic papers. The first one is 2018, which is the French policy paper on the Indo-Pacific. And clearly for France, France is in a special case, because France would claim that it is of the Indo-Pacific because of the territories in the South Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. Okay, so it claims that it is physically present as an Indo-Pacific country. That is not true of Germany, who published the second paper, nor true of the Netherlands, that published a third paper. But I think this reconceptualization of the Indo-Pacific is also a way of sort of, if you like, relativizing the place of China. Because the problem for the EU and the problem for us all, is we're being forced to choose between China and the United States. And the countries of Southeast Asia don't want to be forced to choose. That was also the case in Australia years ago. They don't want to have to choose between the security guarantor and their main trading partner. So the Indo-Pacific allows the European Union, or having a strategy on the Indo-Pacific allows the European Union to sort of relativize the place of China, because you then factor in India more clearly, and you factor in Southeast Asia as a third pole, and then Australasia.
One of the biggest challenge for ASEAN in the next years would be reconciling the economic growth that ASEAN has experienced in last decades with the sustainable transition. So how do you think ASEAN can actually build up a solid, sustainable transition, and how the European Union can actually support this project?
Well, I think this question is linked to also a question of democracy and democratization and the strengthening of civil society. And I very much feel that that is the role of the European Union. It's less at the government to government level and more at the two-track or civil society level. I mean, I'm always impressed by the work of the German Stiftung, the German foundations, political foundations, when I'm in Southeast Asia, because they're able to speak, say, to civil society groups the way that their governments cannot. For example, in Vietnam. And so strengthening the role of civil society groups is very important, because I can see in Vietnam, indeed as in China, the question of the environment at some point no longer is considered political. It's a question of health and human safety and protection of the environment. So we need to sort of, in a sense, depoliticize environmental questions so that they can be discussed and addressed even in authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes. Despite difficulties in many countries, there has been a political space opened up for discussions about environmental concerns. So the European role is really, I think, in relation to civil society. I think that's the carrots, okay? Well, you also need some sticks. Ask yourself the question, where does Europe impose its standards? Stick, so to speak, accompanied with the carrot of cooperation and also of financing of sustainable development in Southeast Asia, the role of the private sector. Why are fossil fuel companies increasingly getting out of producing fossil fuels? Well, it's the market, guys. It's the market, you know.
I mean, how is ASEAN jumping on the wagon, the digital wagon, then in this case, promoting like a digital economy and also supporting like small and medium-sized enterprises? And what room is there for the EU to actually help out in investments or in cooperation with ASEAN in that field?
A lot of the investment that is occurring in the digital economy is local. In e-commerce, particularly in Singapore, and a lot of this comes from Singapore, which is really the financial hub of Southeast Asia. So it's more or less the European role is indirect, in a sense, through investment, you know, via Singapore, particularly in this area. I don't think the EU is going to be driving that sort of that digital economy. I think that what we do see is going to be potentially problematic because of COVID is we are seeing protectionist reflexes throughout the world, you know, which can be understood as the need for self-sufficiency, for example, in supplying vaccines and other basic, you know, medical equipment and medical and pharmaceutical products. So I think that where there can be a common cause between the European Union and the countries of ASEAN is over the question of resilience, economic resilience, and resilience certainly in the area of healthcare. But the lead is not being taken by the EU, but it's being taken more by China in this area.
And my last question regards Myanmar. Of course, you were talking before of civil society, and I always been in Myanmar for a few months, and I saw that civil society is really making a difference. Is taking a bigger role in the country, and also for the democratization of the country. And in one of your articles, you suggested that as a reaction, possible reaction, the European Union might put on hold the strategic partnership with ASEAN. So I was wondering why you think it might be a good option.
I'm always surprised that in Europe we claim that only we can do interregionalism, which is true. You know, only one regional entity, i.e. the EU, can have relationships with another regional entity, with ASEAN. And that's why the EU-ASEAN relations has always been very important for the EU, and indeed for ASEAN, because it was the first inter-regional relationship ever established. It goes back to 1976, 9 years after the creation, the foundation of ASEAN. But we don't seem to use what tools that provides us with. And they include a dialogue mechanism between the European Parliament and the ASEAN Parliamentary Association Organization, something it's called. It's a rather toothless institution. It's not a legislative body. But we do have that framework, which the US doesn't have and no other country has that we could use. I think we need to get a message across to ASEAN because I saw just today, there are a group of lawmakers, or just a few days ago, a week ago, in ASEAN who claim that, the association must intervene in Myanmar. Okay, even if their governments are not, these are people who are no longer in politics. So there is pressure within the ASEAN countries themselves. The starting point is that international organizations and regional organizations and relations between regional organizations increase the power of executives, if they are just left at that level. Unless you put into place, as we have done in Europe with the creation of a legislative parliament, other institutions that can act as kind of counterweight to the executives. But the relationship at its primary level is a relationship between executives, and therefore reinforces the power of executives, whether they be democratically elected or or dictatorships or goodness knows what. But the EU has this possibility with the EU, the parliamentary relations. It has possibility for all these activities we've done with civil society. So why was I saying putting that agreement on hold? I didn't say abandoning it, but there is a, if you like, a precedent for this. In the mid-2000s, the EU refused to attend meetings with ASEAN because if Myanmar was given the presidency of ASEAN, the rotating presidency. And in fact, Myanmar was not given that presidency. It actually took it for the first time in 2014 after Aung San Suu Kyi had entered into parliament. I think we must get a message across that what is happening in Myanmar affects the association as a whole, that we as a European Union don't feel that we can have an equitable relationship with ASEAN if ASEAN seems incapable of imposing on its members, the respect for certain basic norms of human rights and democracy, norms which are actually in the ASEAN Charter. So I think my idea of withholding, ratifying or the ratification, I'm not sure where we are in the European Parliament, but putting on hold that strategic partnership is a way of sending a signal to our friends in ASEAN. Look, this has costs for you, and therefore we will be supporting those within ASEAN in civil society, but also some in parliaments, who do feel that that ASEAN needs to take a stronger role.
So to wrap up, what do you think will be the main priorities for EU-ASEAN cooperation in the next 5 years? So what can we expect, and what will be the main focus points, or what will be happening?
Well, I think the main focus will be on questions of stopping the democratic backsliding in Southeast Asia, which is not just Myanmar. I mean, that's more than a backslide. That's sort of a return to the Dark Ages. But in countries like the Philippines, in Thailand, the last 10 years have seen a backsliding in democracy throughout Southeast Asia. And I think without sort of preaching and without sort of appearing as an imperialistic, again, because of our concern with civil societies, we should be on the side of the civil societies of those countries who, what are they asking for? They're asking for more and more space, to be able to debate on questions like the environment. So that's one area of priority. Obviously, the environment is going to be a key issue because this is a global challenge. And no one country, however powerful, or no one body, such as the EU together as the European Union, can deal with that alone. So it's going to be, we need to be building coalitions of the willing, okay? Which means with China and the US, the good news with the arrival of the Biden administration is that I think on Southeast Asia, the US and the European Union are singing on the same hymn sheets in terms of their priorities, especially questions of democracy and human rights, which were basically put on the back burner under the Trump administration. So I think, yes, the questions of democracy, human rights, and of the environment, and of course, but all of those will be linked to questions of trade. We shouldn't try, and I think we've got to stop compartmentalizing and say, this is all just about business. It's no longer just about business. The environment is no longer just about business. So we need to have a more holistic approach where we try and bring all of these elements together.
Okay, so we will be looking forward to like a more comprehensive approach and cooperation between the EU and ASEAN, which of course the strategic partnership might be able to establish and be used for as a mechanism.
Yes, because I mean, there was an interesting survey done by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, which asks, okay, in order to avoid to not be the victims of Sino-American rivalry, which partners should you look to? Well, Japan, I think, was number one, and the EU was number two. Okay, so basically, in theory, the EU has this possibility of being a kind of a neutral party that allows the small countries of the region who don't want to be the meat in the sandwich, as we say, don't want to be stuck in the middle of a Sino-American rivalry. The EU, say, in terms of investment, in terms of political support, offers, an alternative, as indeed does Japan. And we should play more fully on that place that, we are honest brokers. We're not part of this rivalry, although we may share similar values with the United States. But we offer an alternative. So, between being dependent on China or being dependent on the US, of contributing to your capacity to carve out a space of interdependence, with a third party, which is us.
Well, very good. We will be looking forward to how that will actually will take place and how that will evolve in the future. So at this point, I would like to thank you very much to share your views with us. And I'm sure that we will be continuing this conversation and this discussion over the next couple of years still.
Okay. Look forward to be able to physically getting back to see my friends in the surroundings of your office, which is so well placed.
And of course, you're more than welcome. As soon as possible, or as soon as allowed, we will be able to continue this discussion also live. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Okay.